All right, welcome to the Latest.com show. I'm Igor Garris. Joining us, he's a military vet and Latest.com senior political analyst from Pittsburgh, Josh Patton. And he's a 24-year veteran in the U.S. State Department and the author of We Meant Well from New York, Peter Van Buren. Well, Peter and I are both here in New York, where the Iraqi army is planning to invade to bring democracy to the people after last night's primary. Along with the usual problems, long lines, broken machines, the New York City Comptroller has now launched an audit into the Board of Elections after 125,000 voters were purged from the roll. It was just came in, showed up, they're registered voters, not on the list. But the least democratic aspect of the primary by far didn't even happen last night. It happened years ago. The State Department here in New York made it so that no registered voter can change their party affiliation after October of last year, 193 days before the primary. That's by far the earliest deadline of any state, and only two states in the country, New Hampshire and Kentucky, have deadlines more than 100 days before the primary. So that's 3 million registered voters just here in New York who are not part of this antiquated two-party system, who are not allowed to vote for the only people who are actually eligible to be the next president, realistically. 3 million people in an election where the two candidates are mostly appealing to voters outside of the two-party system, Trump and Sanders. And look, this rule certainly wasn't made to stop either one of them. It certainly didn't stop Trump. He won by 35%, although you got to wonder if independents could vote just how much more he could have won the state by. But it certainly did.
Oh, it would have been embarrassing.
It certainly did contribute to Bernie losing. I mean, these are independent. A lot of his support comes from independents, and the deadline was in October before Bernie Sanders was even a thing. So it contribute to him losing, and he didn't really get going until January, and by that point, no independent can actually join the Democratic Party to vote for him. So the New York establishment not only prevented people from voting for him, but they actually cost themselves hundreds of thousands of new registered Democrats in the process. But again, the rule has nothing to do with Bernie Sanders or Trump or anything, and the rule it has nothing to do with last night's primaries at all. It was created for local elections. It was created for establishment incumbents to make it easier to keep your seat, because here in New York, we don't really have Republicans, not in the city. You win your Democratic primary and you're almost guaranteed to keep your seat. And that's why this rule was created. And, the Hillary people seem to like the rule because it helped her win, and the people that laughed at Trump's kids because they weren't eligible to vote for him because they missed the deadline laughed at it because it's funny. But it doesn't change the bullshit purpose of the rule. It's a rule created to keep new exciting candidates from getting enough voters to win the primary. It's a rule inherently trying to limit the amount of new voters that can participate in the primary. It's working really well. In 2014, New York was among the lowest voter turnout for the primaries of any state in the country. And so it is working. Now, Peter, we've talked about a lot of bullshit rules in this primary process, from the caucuses to the ridiculously long lines in polling places in Arizona, these ridiculous delegate only with no primary conventions in places like Colorado. Peter, isn't this an example of the most unjust and undemocratic state of them all?
Oh, yeah. I mean, if another country was doing it like this and we looked at the State Department's Human Rights Report, it would be full of spit where people were laughing out loud over the pages. We have nothing close to a functioning democracy in our country. We have an ongoing reality show where candidates scream at each other and call each other names on the TV. Then we go out and some of us can vote, some of us can't vote. The rules for voting here are different than the rules for voting there. And then after all that's done, there's the so-called superdelegates who can step in and say, fuck you, voters. We're going to go with the establishment candidate after all. Or in the case of Trump, the Republican Party is going to step in and try to manipulate the rules so that he can't be the nominee. None of this has anything to do with democracy. And of course, we move to the general election where we don't even directly elect our president. We go through some bizarre system that was created in the 18th century because the founders felt that most Americans were too stupid to vote, even when they were restricting the vote to white landowners. So, forget it. Democracy is the wrong word. We might as well call it something else. I don't know, call it banana for lack of anything else. But at the end of the day, it exists to preserve the oligarchy. It exists to preserve the establishment system. And all of us out here, we're just kind of dupes going along with it for our own personal entertainment because it's a slow time for sports.
I think it's impressive the bipartisanship that the New York legislature showed on their part to create this rule. Because it's for both parties. It's not a party rule; it's a state rule. Josh, what do you make of the 6-month deadline to change your party in order to be able to be part of the process?
Oh, it's completely outrageous. I mean, I thought that Pennsylvania's deadline, it was a month ago, to switch your party was outrageous. And, now I want to hug the legislature for, having people, giving people until a month before the actual election to start paying attention and remember that there's a vote coming up that actually matters this time. So that it is pretty awful, although I don't share, I think I have a more rosier outlook on the state of democracy in America than perhaps Peter does. Just because, the primary process, it is not a function of American, the American democratic small d process. It's a party sort of situation. Now, again, not being able to register for the Democratic Party this year is so incredibly stupid. It's hard to even put into words to describe how dumb that is.
Again, going back to the fact that it had nothing to do with yesterday's primary, the actual, local primaries are in September. So the deadline will have been almost a full year before the actual primaries.
Wait, you guys didn't have local primaries yesterday?
No, they're in September. They're later.
No,
that is also insane. I have no idea.
4 elections in New York this year.
Wow.
But let me pick up on Josh's point about how primaries are not part of the great democratic process. They're a party process. Okay, we all get that. We understand that. But first of all, that goes back to days of yesteryear, where the party, in fact, and the people who were running for president were all sort of one and the same. And the electorate was a much smaller group of people who came from that same group of white landowning men. It was a very different process in a very different world and did not...
Well, remember, primaries were beauty contests until 1968. It was no one, they had no actual value in terms of nominating.
Right, it was all decided in the so-called smoke-filled rooms behind the stage.
Right. Now, to be fair though, winning, Bobby Kennedy winning a bunch of primaries leading up to 1968 before he was assassinated absolutely gave him traction for president that, he wasn't supposed to have because it was supposed to be Humphrey's year, right?
Yeah.
Wasn't Humphrey the vice president? So, the fact that trying to democratize the primary process is still a relatively new thing. And I'm not saying that it's not completely fucked and completely corruptible. I'm just saying that I don't think that it's I think it's improved more in our lifetime than it's gotten shittier, if that makes sense.
I'm going to kind of respectfully say, fuck you. No, I didn't mean that, the respectful part. No, I don't, buy that. I think what it's become is a roadshow that gets the frou-frou of democracy, when in fact it's simply the parties doing what they want to do, and giving us all the impression that we're participating. It's like elections in North Korea, where, everybody goes and votes, and at the end they count it up and they announce a winner.
Peter, if you feel that way, imagine how your upstate neighbors feel. The ones who are deeply red Republican. And again, to further sort of defend the Electoral College and the delegate system, it is a more fair way to represent perhaps not direct numbers of people. Because here in PA, we're Pittsburgh and Philly, that's where our population is, and those are about as rock solid Democratic, especially in sort of the modern context, with conservatism being what it is, as New York or Los Angeles. But everywhere else in the state, is deeply red. So when it comes to things like the Electoral College, I think that there would be as much of an argument for sort of just popular vote being unfair as there is for the Electoral College being stupid. I mean, I don't know if one is better than, I think they have the same amount of problems. And so with the term, and same thing with these delegates things, super delegates, yeah, they're bullshit. But I absolutely think that the sort of current delegate system is not fatally flawed. I feel like if perhaps it was more localized, instead of Bernie Sanders running through, giving a rally, and then saying start a revolution, and then bouncing without ever meeting like a local, liberal progressive prosecutor or Senate candidate in the state. I mean, John Fetterman here, he's the mayor of Braddock. He is the guy Bernie talks about every time. His town is the town that Bernie talks about every time he talks about his populist revolution thing. And Fetterman has hosted events for him and Bernie. Now, to be fair, putting Bernie Sanders on it gives it more of a, like, ooh, it's exciting. But, he's not even been contacted by the campaign. Revolution and whatnot, and get delegates and things like that, if you can't build coalitions of the people who already agree with you.
Yeah. Parenthetically, I just want to mention that there is a brilliant documentary called Braddock, PA, that looks at what happened to the town and the income inequality there and when the industry went away. It's one of those things that, might someday show up buried on Netflix. But if you ever get a chance to see it, anybody out there who's interested in these things, it is, in fact, it could be the documentary that explains the philosophical underpinnings of Bernie Sanders' campaign. Well worth checking out. I don't know. Were we talking about something before that?
Well, I think you guys mentioned a good question somewhere in there. On the one hand, they are party primaries, right? Like the parties aren't the government; they're private entities. So in theory, independents shouldn't really be part of them. But at the same time, one of these 5 people is going to be the president. We don't really have a choice of a bunch of different parties. You're going to have one of these people, and forget the president part. I mean, primaries take place for every office, and usually you only get 2 real choices at the end of it. So, Josh, how do we fix the existing primary process to make it more fair, given that, there's parties, but there's also independents that are pretty much enslaved to these parties because that's where their candidates are coming from?
Well, I think that the one way you can do that is most people who are independents, tend to do so because they feel like their party doesn't represent them anymore. I mean, that's why the Republicans have been shedding numbers for years. So I think there's 3 major things that can be done to fix primaries. First is fuck caucuses. They're stupid and bad. Straight elections, and in that discussion, there's talk, we should side mention that there needs to be a kind of rescheduling, whether that's a national primary or 5 Super Tuesdays or like a rotating thing. I mean, that's up for debate, but Iowa, New Hampshire, you've gone first enough. It's time to, they had 18 months to decide on a candidate. We get 4 months and they're sloppy seconds. So I don't think that works as well as they think. And also, you need to make voting as easy as possible. Same day registration everywhere. If you're an independent and you want to come vote for Bernie or you want to come vote for Trump, you go up to a table, say, I want to be a Democrat or a Republican now, and it happens. It's 2016. We can pull this off. And along with that comes other things like more budgets, so there's more poll workers, more polling places, better quality machines. I mean, just everything to be done. Everything should be done to make voting as easy as possible while maintaining the integrity of the process. And then last but not least, they need to require campaigns. Again, if we're going to continue with the delegate system and letting the parties set their own rules, they need to make their rules. They need to force the candidates to get local. Like Hillary should be appearing with the delegates that she needs to elect. When she appeared in Philadelphia, she should be like, this is Karen and Dave, and they would be our delegates. So, and then they can just walk around and do events all the time while Hillary's gone because, here I am with Hillary. I'm her delegate. I am basically, and it would force campaigns to be more local, and it would force them to not just be able to sort of buy elections because you actually need active bodies. I think Bernie's kind of already won in that money is not playing the role that it used to. Jeb Bush spent so much money to lose. And so I feel like if you're able to get people aware that the political ads are probably mostly bullshit, and then have sort of local figures so that when the delegates are elected, it's Karen and Dave. It's not some backroom smoky, shook the right hands kind of person.
So, I agree with
Yes.
you that we need to make voting as easy as possible. I mean, there's no reason the government should ever make voting more difficult than it already is. But when you say that we need to make voting more local, and then you say we need to have a national or regional primary, isn't that contradictory? Because then you're going to have candidates who are going to be spending more time on ads to reach more places, only really focusing on going to the major population centers, and then it becomes less local in that scenario.
I will see the point that there's a kind of political fan fiction element to my argument here. But no, I actually don't think it does. Again, I would prefer, say, 5 Super Tuesdays spread out between January and the convention. So that gives a lot of time for people to go around. But then, again, the candidate will come once or twice to an area, have their delegates, and make their delegates a part of their campaign in that state, so that then the delegates can go out and campaign rather than Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, whatever. And again, especially for someone like Sanders, if you're trying to start a revolution in the Republican Party like Goldwater did in the 60s with the Republicans, you need to have that kind of local engagement. I said that campaigns, the party should force their candidates to do that. Maybe they're not the right thing for them to do, but every campaign should want to do that. Everywhere John Fetterman goes in PA every single day is essentially a Bernie event, but there's no picture of him and Bernie holding their hands up, looking like a team that would, help sell that message for Sanders even more. And then he could spend more time.
Of these regional primaries, this handful of Super Tuesdays. This process goes on far, far, far too long. There's a lot of people who are just kind of getting tired of it. I think it also puts more emphasis on the money, even though, as Josh pointed out, Jeb Bush spent a lot of money to lose. All these people are spending a lot of time fundraising. Whether they do anything useful with the money or not is another point. And that leads to the excesses that Bernie Sanders has talked constantly about with Hillary Clinton, where these candidates are just whores to the people who give them money. So a tighter period of time makes sense. Regionally, it makes sense. At some point, we're going to have to say that, badass Wyoming there's just not a lot of people out there, and we have to recognize that. Proportionality is covered in Congress so that the people of badass Wyoming are not left completely on their own. But to give them too much emphasis in these processes is also wrong. The other point I think that's in there, and I think I want to just tag up on what Josh said and you, Igor, about making this process easier. The other day in New York, when I voted, I went to, they had a giant paper like encyclopedia book of the names of all the people who were supposed to vote at that polling station. Now, we've got 12 million people in the metro area here in New York City. I don't know what percentage are registered voters, but the point is there are millions and millions of people who are represented in those big, giant, spiral-bound books. This is an insane system. What we should have is a set of software, a set of technology that if we can't figure out how to do it, on the internet or something clever like that, just put it in big trucks like it's a rock and roll show and drive it around from state to state. And it's like, okay, Iowa, you're up next week. We're going to show up in town. There's going to be roadies, set up this whole system. The votes get counted electronically. There's less opportunity for cheating. It doesn't have to be Grandma Moses sitting at a table arguing about whether your Book of the Month Club ID is sufficient to vote or not, and all these other ridiculous local things that suck up time, that suck up energy, and provide so many opportunities for fraud, malfeasance, and just sort of dumbassery. So we have got to get a hold of this process. We cannot have every one of these primaries, and we know in the general election that we're going to have the same kind of thing. We can't have these things run like circuses the way they are. We're America. We're supposed to be like, technology and, internet and apps and all that stuff. I think we could apply a little bit of that to our elections.
I think given that our nuclear subs are still using floppy disks, that's pretty technologically advanced. Mm-hmm. I think one of the other things about, you mentioned proportionality, I think one of the interesting parts of last night's results was that every district gives you the same amount of votes, no matter how many Republicans are in it. Donald Trump won the Bronx, which has multiple districts and it has a population of 1.4 million. He won 4,000 votes and won it by, I think, 60 or 70%, getting all of the delegates in the process. I mean, the poor proportionality. And it's funny because Trump always complains that, the delegates don't match the votes. Like, you're right, they don't. You get way more delegates than you deserve. But, all right, so, when you look at this...
But Kasich won Manhattan and got 2.
He got 2, and Ted Cruz lost the district to Ben Carson, and he's still somehow in the race. What are you going to say, Peter?
Yeah, and Pete's a rat. But, blow that question up to a bigger level. I mean, we're still dividing in the national election. We're still dividing everything by the state boundaries, which were drawn in 1780, whatever. That were drawn based on the King's land grants in the 17th century. And that doesn't make any sense either. I mean, particularly in places where you have mega cities. I mean, New York City and New York State have nothing really in common, and the population is so lopsided. The same thing with mega cities, California, Los Angeles, San Francisco, lesser in some places, but even in Josh's Pennsylvania or Ohio, I mean, all these places, you've got these cities that just so dominate the landscape that just saying, the Ohio River sets the boundary, and it has since the days of Tecumseh, so I guess that's how we'll run this election in 2016. Oh, well, that doesn't make much sense either. We need to take, in a perfect world, a much more comprehensive look about the system that we use to choose our so-called leaders.
Well, in a perfect world, I mean, let's look at, just the rise of Trump and, the differences between Trump and the Republican Party. Let's look at the rise of Sanders and the difference between him and the Democratic Party. When we talk about all these problems, isn't the point that we need more parties? Like, not a third party, but multiple other parties, Josh?
Yes.
Again, I am a dirty, filthy statist because I'm cool with the two-party system. I don't think we're not set up to have
30 million people and you have 2/10 that can't possibly fit everyone else.
Sure. Look, I understand it. And if ever there was an argument for a third-party candidate to make a run for it, it is having the two most unpopular presidential nominees since they started tracking this sort of thing. But here's what happens. Let's say Bernie or, Jill Stein rallies and, there's this strong third-party contender, and the socialist picks up a handful of states, Hillary picks up a handful of states, Trump picks up a handful of states. No one gets to 270. You know who picks the president, right? It's the House of Representatives. So that's hello, President Paul Ryan.
That's one way of creating that system. Another way would be like, for example, they have in Louisiana where everyone runs and then the top 2 vote getters have a runoff election at the end. And that way you're not, it doesn't matter whether Democrat, Independent, Republican. It's just that you get a runoff.
I mean, that would take a significant rewrite of the Constitution to pull off. But, I'm not saying that the conversation shouldn't be had. But, right now it's too late sort of for that. So, I do think that the two-party system sort of works, but again, it involves a level of participation that, the type of people who rallied to Obama and are rallying to Bernie Sanders aren't willing to put in. Again, part of the reason that conservatives own everything is because the local activists will challenge the incumbents from the right if they don't get their way. And the Democrats don't do that. They don't have that kind. I mean, they're too busy trying to destroy each other before they win, whereas the Republicans at least wait until they hold the office and then start stabbing each other in the kidneys.
The idea of rewriting the Constitution. Obviously, I mean, we can't even figure out, what we want out of Obamacare. We're probably going to stay, on the light side of rewriting the Constitution. But the discussion has validity in the sense that it pokes around the edges of why some people are so dissatisfied with the process, and so cynical about it. I worry about sort of self-disenfranchisement, if you will. A lot of young people, for example, just kind of throwing up, their hands and saying, this process is bullshit. Why do I even waste my time on this? I voted, I worked my backside off to support Bernie, and there was some superdelegate thing that happened, which I don't even understand, and somehow Hillary's still winning. I think there's a element of cynicism.
I mean, to be fair, Bernie could have won by the same margin as Hillary, and it still would have only been a moral victory. I mean, just because of the way that she's won the delegates thus far. I mean, I do think that it does come down to the primary system has to be fixed so people feel like it's more representative and more small d democratic.
Exactly.
I don't know if like blowing up both parties or abandoning the parties is the best way to go about getting that change. That sounds to me like the best way to get the worst fucking guys.
The people have already abandoned the parties. The Republicans make up 23% of registered voters. Democrats make up less than 30% of registered voters. The people have already abandoned the parties, and that's not even counting the people who are now, after Trump will go away, that's going to be a large chunk of the Republican Party that's like, the fuck do we do now? We go back 4 years, all those Ron Paul voters, that's millions of people that don't have a voice in that party. Same with Bernie now, when Hillary inevitably wins. The people have already left the parties.
Yeah,
fair point.
And that's the whole thing. I mean, Trump, he's running for the Republican nomination because that's sort of the one that's up for grabs, that's available to him. But I mean, it's a stretch of an argument to call him a Republican in the sense that he represents the what we believe to be the Republican Party. And the same thing with Bernie. Yeah, but I mean, the idea is that these party systems are crumbling in front of our eyes, but they're still being propped up. I mean, Hillary is the ultimate establishment Democratic candidate, and if they can figure out any way at all to get rid of Trump, then they'll put up somebody on the Republican side who fits the same mold. We joke about how a year and a half ago, whenever this thing all started, it was supposed to be Hillary versus Jeb. Straight on through. Well, it's still Hillary, and Jeb is Jeb, but there's still an awful lot of people in the Republican Party structure who want to see a Jeb-like entity running against Hillary. They may end up settling for some douchebag like Ted Cruz or whatever. But the point is that both parties are struggling to keep their establishment candidates in the game if it's any way possible. The Democrats seem to have succeeded, mainly because of the incredible influence that the Clintons have over their party, and their unbelievable ability to shrug off criticism problems, and in fact, full-on FBI investigations into national security violations. I mean, that's a hell of a thing to kind of say, hey, that doesn't really matter. Let's move on and talk about what's important. Sorry.
It was uncanny.
I just had a little stroke there. I'm okay now. I'm okay.
Well, you mentioned the possible Cruz candidacy. I think up until yesterday, the narrative seemed to be overwhelmingly that Trump isn't likely to get 1237, and the GOP convention will go to a second ballot. And because Ted Cruz is winning the ground game and the party hates Trump, it's almost impossible for Trump to win on a second ballot. But at the same time, Trump won 90 out of a possible 95 delegates. Cruz finished behind even Kasich. And like I mentioned, in one county, he finished behind Ben Carson, who hasn't been in the race for months. So, Josh, does last night change the overall landscape and suggest that Trump has a legitimate chance to get 1237 before the convention? Or is last night's win kind of expected since the poll numbers pretty much predicted it, and so nothing really changed?
Well, I absolutely, I don't know. I feel like the fact that Trump, that his win was so big, absolutely helps the argument that he's pretty much going to be the nominee. I know there's still some crazy delegate math shit that can happen, and he could wind up short, or but I don't think he's going to get overtaken. And there would have to be some sort of convention rat fuckery going on to deny him the nomination, and that would probably create a schism in the Republican Party that it probably wouldn't survive, especially if all the conservatives stormed off. Although arguably, a greater thing couldn't happen to the Republican Party than that. But I absolutely think that the big lesson from last night is that Cruz, as the alternative to Trump, is not your guy. Kasich, I think he couldn't have done good or poorly last night. So his 25% in winning Manhattan, it feels like a moral victory, but it doesn't mean much. I think if Kasich doesn't gain ground here in Pennsylvania, which, being from Pittsburgh, and, winning Ohio and Ohio and PA are sort of similar states in the ways that Republicans can win them. If he can't overtake Trump here, it's completely confirmed that he's just running as a spoiler for Cruz at that point. But then again, Cruz being the nominee, you can say goodbye to any ultra-conservative, highly religious kind of states.
It's not like Mitt Romney was a social liberal.
Well, no, but he was making that play for the middle that all sort of Republican candidates have to try to make. And, Bush won it. He was able to successfully make that argument. McCain tried it, but there was a lot of other things going on in McCain's campaign. And Obama's. Yeah. We don't have to say her name because I think she appears then and says, "You betcha." But so that's sort of not fair. But then Mitt Romney, that was, I think, the first time we saw that pitch for the center fail. And I absolutely believe that the Republicans were aware of it, and they thought, leading in with Jeb and then Marco Rubio jumping in, that by appealing to Latinos, they could get that Bush coalition back. That's obviously not going to happen now. So I feel like once they get to the convention, they're going to have to decide, all right, it's either Trump or we blow this whole thing up and, try again next year. And I think that will also, one quick sidebar, and then I'll let Peter have at it, is that I think that will tell us for sure how they actually do feel about Hillary Clinton. If they're willing to blow up their convention in the party to not elect Trump or Cruz and possibly damage the Republican brand even further, that'll mean that they are kind of cool with Hillary. If they do say, fuck it, Trump, go Trump, that means they really don't want her. So I think will be an interesting sort of thing to...
Poll, Peter, what is the difference really between Trump and blowing up the party?
Well, the difference is that if you, and I don't think they're going to blow up the party. I think they will either figure out some bizarro way to get Trump to voluntarily slide aside, which I'm just throwing in there as a, one day gravity might fail, and we'll wake up and we'll be floating. But
right.
I think that the idea is that, the Republican Party wants to win the White House, and they're going to win it with the candidate that they've got. And it isn't going to be pretty and it isn't going to be perfect. But I think that they would be able to sell Trump on a vice president that's more of a party person.
He's already talking about Trump that. He mentioned Scott Walker and Rubio and guys like that as potential VPs.
Who all laughed, by the way.
Yeah.
They all laughed.
Yeah,
but then when it's offered to you, things change real quick.
Oh, I'm sure they'll take it, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not ready to... I don't think it's ready to stick a name on it, but we'll say a mainstream sort of Republican as vice president. The idea that Trump is so freaking stupid that he will be manipulable when he's in the White House. They'll be able to get advisors in there, cabinet positions, or whatever. The idea would be that once Trump is in there, he's a Republican, and they can they at least have a shot at manipulating the system. Obviously, if Hillary wins, then the Republican Party has to crawl back in its hole for a couple of years and try again in 4 years. So I think Trump is going to be I think last night decided who the presumptive nominees are, who the actual nominees are going to be. Trump versus Clinton, absent some event that's beyond predicting.
Right.
Who wins is going to get really, really tough to parse out, especially this early on. But, I think both candidates, Josh was mentioning how they're the most unpopular candidates in electoral history. And I think they're going to run their campaigns sort of, if you will, it's kind of like a judo move where they take that weakness and use it as a strength. And both of them are going to feature heavily in their campaigns. You may not like me, but if you don't vote for me, you're going to get that one. And that's how Trump may pull in some of the people that are more Cruz-like, and how Hillary is going to pull in some of the Bernie voters that hate her guts, but really are far more terrified of Trump than they are hateful of him.
Well, look, I
To
think
build on that too, it'll be interesting to see if Trump is capable of doing his impressive political superpower of letting criticism and things that would end campaigns just slough off his back in the general election. Because, he doesn't, when they talk about the Muslim ban, when they talk about the wall, when they talk about all Mexicans are rapists and drug dealers, he still gets cheers at his rallies, and I'm sure he will during the general, but to a general election audience, that plays way worse. And I think from his speech last night, as, every person is, that watched it and didn't hear the words Lion Ted, said is like, he's trying to pivot to being more presidential. He called him Senator Cruz. He kept it short, wasn't very outlandish, So if he's able to successfully make everybody else forget about the past 8 months, yeah, it'll be a real dogfight.
Well, I think we have a tendency to get caught up in this one-day news cycle narrative. I don't think anyone expected Trump to not just kill it last night in New York. So when you look at the overall landscape, just a couple of days ago, you had Mitch McConnell, the leader of the Senate Republicans, came out still hoping for an open convention. Nothing has really changed. When you look at the state conventions, Ted Cruz continues to sweep up. And look, even in the delegates that we call Trump delegates, they have to vote for him. They're probably a lot of them aren't going to vote for him on a second ballot. And mind you, before you even get to the voting, we're probably going to have some votes on rules. Now, while they're bound to vote for Trump, on the first ballot, they can vote however they want on the rules. They're not obligated to Trump for anything. So are we really that sure that it's going to be Trump, given how little support he has within the actual party, not the voters?
Because the party has got to, if any brain cells are left in
the Peter, you said that it's going to be, you don't know how the race is going to play out. When you look at the polls, I know it's early, but you're talking about Trump, a candidate who would put Utah on the table. The state Democrats haven't won since the 60s. He put Mississippi on the table, which is unthinkable.
The thing is that...
But he put Virginia back on the table for the red team, and, I doubt he'd make an argument that he puts New York on the table, but of course he doesn't.
He got 250,000.
But then again, an effective. Who knows? Because everything we say about Trump is going to turn off voters tends to not do that. That's sort of why New York was so important. He's had a bad couple weeks with Ted Cruz, and then whining about not knowing the process. He's looked like a fool, and I don't think any of us expected him to lose New York, but to him to do like the 35 and then the 28 for Ted and then the leftovers for Kasich, if that had been what New York looked like, we'd be having a different conversation today. They had one of their worst weeks, I think, as a campaign since it started. And they fucking killed it. So I think that was sort of
about putting New York and Virginia on the table. Donald Trump got 250,000 less votes than Bernie Sanders did last night. The numbers just
I know, and that's why I said they would make that argument. That one isn't real, but Virginia would be on the table. Because it's not as solidly blue as people think.
And that's why, the Republican leaders, if you will, the establishment leaders are really going to have to think this one carefully. They cannot ignore the popular support Trump has. And they have to be cognizant that if they play some kind of rules game that bumps him out, if he's close to the delegate count, they're going to have to deal with the fact that they're going to alienate huge portions of the people who would normally vote Republican. If those folks just say to hell with it,
I was going to say they would need the reanimated corpse of Ronald Reagan to give that 1976 Party Unity speech that they gave to even come close to stopping the. Oh yeah, of course, but you know, I'm just saying they would need some kind of like transcendental American iconic moment to just make it not be Hillary Clinton running against the desiccated corpse of an elephant.
Yeah, well, maybe they could replay the video or the stuff they do with holograms now. That's pretty.
Hologram Reagan.
The hologram Reagan.
I guarantee you that might be a surprise. You know, Trump said he wants it to be more showbiz. Hologram fucking Reagan. Oh, please, Jesus and Buddha.
Mrs. Clinton, you support that wall. You know, they could just do this.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. But, I mean, like, okay, so here we are. We're going on record. It's going to be Trump versus Clinton in the fall. And that's that. They're both going to pick weak, little wilting flowers as vice presidents, mainly because their egos are far too huge to do anything else. And neither of them, they're both of them in the position of, you know, the old political slogan that the only way that guy's going to lose is if they find a live boy or a dead girl in his bed or her bed. Because they both are able to shrug this stuff off. I mean, it's if you wanted to throw one more kind of we've never seen it before factor into this race, along with all the others, it's that. Any other candidate in American history who had an active national security investigation against them would be having a hard time. Any other candidate who said the crazy stuff that Trump says, I mean, and gets away with it or actually gains votes by it. So this is going to be one for the record books. But in the end, it's very difficult to imagine a better America led by either of those two people.
While we're discussing this nonsense convention.
So that's that.
That's that. While we're discussing the convention stuff, Bernie Sanders' campaign manager, Jeff Weaver, last night said that if Sanders, well, yeah, he did the map thing and it was gross, but if Sanders has less of the popular vote and pledged delegates after all the primaries are over, they're still going to try to spend the summer flipping super delegates, which is basically impossible, and not, you know, uniting behind Hillary and all that. You know, the plan is iffy at best, cringeworthy as Josh's face illustrated. But the point is, Josh, can you imagine if Hillary Clinton's campaign manager said the same thing? We would be losing our shit today.
Actually, we don't have to because they said it in 2008. I think before Hillary, yeah, everyone lost their shit. Like, you know, I get that Bernie supporters are young, but this isn't the first time we've had this superdelegate discussion, which I think is also hilarious because where were all the, you know, Puma people and, you know, the Obama people mad about superdelegates changing it in the party for this one? Oh, wait, they didn't because no one cares. But to be honest, it's a terrible strategy, and it makes. And I don't think this is Sanders' fault at all. Sanders is definitely. He has to say that he's going to win. You know, you can't be the candidate and say, you know what, I'm just running to make a point now. I mean, fucking Ron Paul did it, and he looked crazy when he did it. But your staff, now, they need to be less committed than you. And, I mean, all of Sanders' surrogates are ratcheting up sort of the attacks and sort of the rhetoric and the tone, and I think it absolutely hurts Sanders. Because, to be fair, New York election shit show that it was, Hillary Clinton still beat Bernie by, what was it? She got 58%, he got 42%. I mean, that's not just, I mean, that's an actual win, I think. There was just more people supporting Hillary there than Bernie. And I think part of the reason was for, you know, people who were already registered Democrats, possibly already on Hillary Clinton's side, was how vitriolic the tone sort of became when Bernie Sanders' introduction to the country was, I'm not going to play this I think she sucks game. I'm going to tell you why my plan is better, and that's what you're going to hear. We've said in the past that he needs to sort of change up how he delivers his message, and he did change up, but instead of his message, he was tearing down Hillary, and I think that worked against him in a state where she was strong. If it was a state where she was already kind of struggling, it maybe would have put him over. Maybe that, sort of pivoting to that early Michigan helped. I don't know, but I think that he's being completely underserved by his surrogates and campaign staff. And that's something that, if he tries to address it, would be like, uh-oh, Sanders campaign shakeup falling apart. But, Peter, if he wants to keep going as he should.
Peter, do you think, obviously a campaign has to make the case to the voters that I'm not out of it, you have to come vote for me, but doesn't the idea that if I get less votes, like it was one thing when you were shitting on superdelegates because Hillary might have won just on the strength of superdelegates alone, but doesn't this undermine the entire message when you say that I don't care that not enough people voted for me, I'm going to play the establishment game?
Yeah, no. It was a dumb move on his campaign manager's part. It reeked of desperation. I think a lot of core Sanders people kind of looked at it and said, "Really, dude? That's what you're saying now?" As you guys have pointed out, you got to say something. You got to say, "I'm in it to win it," and the way Kasich still does and things like that. But at the same time, threatening or acting that way, or I'm going to take my ball and go home stuff. It just doesn't work. I do want to make one point, though, about Bernie's change of tone, and that there is a difference between sort of picking on each other, and certainly Trump has been a perfect example. He's literally calling his opponents names, and being more aggressive about pointing out the faults and problems of the other candidate that in fact are relevant to the election. I think Bernie had a hard time in the beginning understanding he could do that. He didn't have to say Hillary's a wonderful person in every way, but he could have said, let's look at her record on Libya, let's look at her decision-making as Secretary of State, things like that, and been a little more aggressive about it without resorting to name-calling, quote-unquote, going negative. He did he did a mediocre job of promoting his own stuff in a positive way. I think people never really have not really figured it out. I've got a piece I'm working up about paying for Bernie's healthcare plan and how that might work and how other countries do it. We'll take a look. But not to make it sound like I should be running for something, though I'd happy to accept contributions. The idea is that as I'm trying to go through that and I'm looking, well, what are the taxes like in France? How much do people pay in Britain for their free health care? I couldn't help but wondering, is there anybody on Bernie's staff who's doing this same thing? The chart that I found online comparing taxes in these different countries, nobody in Bernie's staff found that and was able to counter Hillary's argument that we can't afford it. I think he's not done a good job of explaining his own stuff, and I think he's been far too cautious about pointing out Hillary's foibles. And he is where he is now because of that, and he can stay in the race, and that's good, and keep talking, but that campaign manager stuff.
And to his credit, I don't think that the stuff, other than the unqualified thing, which I think was just a side effect of the fact that it's been 18 fucking months and it's starting to feel personal, But other than that, he's done a decent job of sort of saying that, couching those criticisms in saying that I think I'm better than her in terms of judgment. And then he started saying things like he would take her over Donald Trump any day, stuff like that. That's how you do it. It's his campaign that is like, one of his surrogates introducing her called Hillary Clinton a corporate whore. They threw money at her SUV going to a fundraiser, not thinking of the optics of throwing, money at women. And I agree that it's a sort of a specious kind of charge, but it does change the conversation then from why they were throwing the money to should they have because of it's sort of bad strategy that way. And, to bring up your talk of his healthcare plan, I've done a story or two on some of the independent analyses of his healthcare plans too. And I think like part of what happened was he told his campaign, I want this to be the thing. And they came up with these numbers because they're like, we need to say we're going to do this, but we also need to sell it to people. So they ended up coming up with very, very dubious information. I mean, their first savings amount of like what they were going to save in medicine and whatnot was more than America spends on prescription medicine in a year. So then they were like, we meant actually 100,000 less or a million less than we said.
Yeah.
It was so instead of having like a more, either more vague or more fair analysis of his plans, it's been, we put out this sunshine day, sunshine, rainbows, and puppy dogs estimate of how it's going to be, allowing even pro-socialized medicine people to be like, look, they're not being truthful about this.
Yeah.
So I feel like, he's been underserved by a lot of his campaign staff, save for their fundraising team, because those guys are absolutely killing it.
Well, I mean, holy shit.
I agree, absolutely.
I mean, checking when Obama was going around promising you can keep your doctor in your health care plan. I mean, that was always impossible, too. A lot of
where was all that fact checking? That's a hell of a question. The idea that we got sold a bill of goods on the Affordable Care Act is slowly becoming apparent to people that it is not anything close to the healthcare solution that we needed, that the compromises that were made were such that it basically diluted the whole thing. There's an excellent article last week in the New York Times talking about how, because we insisted on a capitalist model where companies were going to compete for business within the ACA, that a lot of these companies aren't making any money and they're pulling out, reducing the competition and driving up the prices. In addition, as prices go up, Congress is certainly not going to be voting any more money into the pool for the subsidies for poor people, which means more of them are going to be excluded from health care because once again, they're not going to be able to afford it. But again, speaking of fact checking, allowing Hillary Clinton to kind of get a pass by nodding and saying, well, the Affordable Care Act is, the best we can do, and I'm going to support it without bringing up these kinds of issues, once again points to the question of who's working for Bernie. A classic example, stepping away from healthcare in the last debate, where one of the commentators asked him to name a specific example where Hillary's decisions were influenced by her Wall Street money. Now, first of all, who could not have anticipated something like that? I mean, it was like everybody knew that kind of a question was going to come. Everybody knew it. And the fact that he had nothing to really say, he didn't have any specific examples, nor did he have kind of a witty, pithy remark.
Right.
The media people on Twitter were already bringing up one of her votes, for example, on bankruptcy laws, nearly simultaneous with Bernie stumbling on his own answer. I mean, this was sort of a couple of Google clicks away. This wasn't really hard to come up with. I mean, even a pithy answer like, no, I'm sure they gave her, $500,000 for speeches, hoping there was no influence on her whatsoever. Even something like that.
Or just something saying like you can't prove what, like the reform she didn't pass. I can't show you the bill she didn't sponsor. I mean, that's how you say it. You make it seem like they paid her to do nothing because that's how that argument should play out.
Yeah. Pick one, but have it ready. And yet he didn't have any of those things ready. He just stammered his way through that. The same thing, for example, because we're really, what we're doing here is a postmortem on the Sanders campaign. The same thing on gun control. Hillary has banged him with that every single debate. You'd think by this point in time, Bernie would have something he could say. I mean, she wanted him to apologize to the children of Sandy Hook. I mean, geez, come on. You got nothing on that, Bernie? Nothing?
Yeah.
You don't even, how dare you try to make a tragedy into a political point, Mrs. Secretary? How dare you take the lives of those children and try to manipulate them on this stage? Apologize? I won't apologize to anyone for your action. I mean, I'm just pulling it out of my ass, and it sounds better than what you said.
He should have hired you, really.
Yeah, well,
it's only to do robocalls for him.
Yeah, I'm yelling at people on street corners. In case anybody is on the Upper East Side of New York, I'm available on the bus stop. In fact, as soon as we're off the podcast.
Well, if we're doing a post-mortem on the Sanders candidacy, what about the Sanders revolution? I mean, presumably these people aren't going to go away. Like Bernie's going to go away. Where do they go, Josh?
Well, I think that's what I think that if the best thing that if Sanders believes in the revolution, the best thing he could do now is bring the sort of spotlight that comes with him now onto the John Fettermans and the other candidates that I'm sure exist in your state, even though you're not going to vote for them until September, and other states where you can say, here's the type of person who shares my values, and this is, he needs to anoint some people, as Goldwater anointed Reagan when he won the governorship, but the other thing that might happen too is it might have worked. Like the message might be in people's heads now, younger voters, that, it might convince them after a devastating loss like this to get more involved and try to have the revolution on the inside, because trust me, the think pieces will be coming about how the revolution could continue without Bernie Sanders. And it'll involve things that no one ever wants to do, like get involved with local politics. But if enough people get inspired by it, maybe in 3 elections, the Democrats will nominate their version of Reagan, some, perfect-looking presidential person who's witty and funny and, has terrible ideas.
I mean, look, you're literally talking about a generation. You're talking about a generation later. Peter, are the Bernie voters going to come out and finally fucking vote in the 2018 midterms?
Of course not.
I worry that the Bernie voters, a lot of them, are going to be sucked down that tunnel of that a lot of people felt after 2008. Where Obama was supposed to be, was such an inspirational candidate. He brought so many young people into the political process. He brought a lot of middle-class voters enthusiastically into supporting him. And then, nearly from day one, buyer's remorse sunk in, and we were left kind of a cynical bunch of old farts. And so the worry I have is I hope Josh is right. I very much hope I'm wrong. But the worry is that an awful lot of these young people kind of say, the game is rigged. Bernie's right. There's no reason for me to even waste my time on this stuff anymore. What they do in this election is a more immediate question. But I mean, in terms of the long term, I worry that they'll just sort of give up on politics. The best maybe we could hope for is that they turn some of that energy local. But on a national stage, it may be very difficult to bring them back and convince them they can play a role.
Peter, I know you think it's horseshit, but if Clinton were to nominate someone like Elizabeth Warren as her vice president, do you think I know you don't think it will happen, but let's, pretend it does. Do a whip it and tell me if you think that would actually pull enough of the Bernie people in to maybe give Clinton some progressive legitimacy and political capital as a president.
No matter what happens, she's going to pick someone more liberal than she is, which isn't that hard to do in that party.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, if I can somehow get past the mental block of her choosing a powerful person like Elizabeth Warren, a personality, as well as another woman. I think there would be some hope there. I don't think Hillary can reach out to Bernie's core supporters. I don't think so. But Elizabeth Warren likely could, possibly would have the best chance, I think, of people doing it. how much she's willing to do that and how much she can do it from, assuming that she doesn't get chosen as vice president, how much she can do it sort of from the sidelines, I'm less clear on. But that might be a way of keeping some of these younger people out of the pit of cynicism, sure.
All right. Well, that seems as hopeful a note to end this show on as any. Next week.
It's positively sunny.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to go put the gun in my mouth now, so I may be late on my articles tomorrow, Igor. Depends on how the doctors do on the surgery.
We'll be back next week after the last big primary day until June. We've got 5 states voting next week. That'll be fun. Thanks for tuning in. Keep reading Latest.com.